Thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Depending on how one counts, I'm either the longest serving or one of the two or three longest serving members of the Army War College faculty. So I have spent a lot of time behind this podium over the years. It's going to be a big adjustment a year from now when we actually have to, when we're moving into the new academic building and I have to help break in a new podium over there. I'm here today to talk about American grand strategy, the way that the nation integrates, or in some cases attempts to integrate, its elements of national power to pursue its interest. I actually gave a noontime lecture on that here in 2010 that's been on YouTube since then. So the folks from the distance education program came to me several months ago and asked if I would like to kind of update that and provide a new version. And I really jumped on it because because a lot has happened in that amount of time, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So this was a good opportunity for me to kind of codify and organize the thoughts that I've been doing really over the past 12 years on that topic. I want to start by explaining the main point that I'm going to lead toward. I mean, we all know that in a briefing you do bottom line up front. You've been at the War College long enough that you probably know that every paper you write is supposed to have a clear thesis statement up front that indicates exactly what your final point is. I spent 7 years writing a weekly column on defense and security affairs, and sometimes at great pain, the editors there had to teach me what a lead was. That in any kind of type of journalistic writing, you have kind of your main point in the first or second paragraph. So I want to kind of do that today in this presentation. So here's my thesis is if you look back to, let's say 1945 or the late 1940s, there have been some adjustments in American grand strategy. But I would argue that since 1945 up to the present, there has been much more continuity in America's grand strategy than there has been change. What that means is there also has been, I would argue, a great deal of continuity in the way the US military is organized and what it does in the world. I was kind of thinking through this as I was preparing for this talk. And it occurred to me that the US military of today, 2022, looks a lot more like the military of 1945, which is a period of 77 years, then the military of 1945 looked like its predecessor 77 years earlier. If you're math challenged like me, you don't have to pull out your calculator. I'll tell you, it was 1868. I mean, think of how different the US military was in organization and in purpose in 1945 and 1868. So I would argue that there was much more difference then than there is between the military of 1945 and 2022. And I think one of the major reasons for that is because of this continuity in grand strategy. The US military has basically been asked to do sort of the same thing globally since at least the late 1940s or maybe 1950 than it did in the decades before that. But, and here's the key point, I think we may be entering a period of revolutionary change in American grand strategy. Not adjustment, not modest change, but of revolutionary change. And if that turns out to be true, I believe that in the next decade or 2 decades, we may also need a revolutionary change in the nature of the US military. Not only what it's organized, but what it's prepared to do. And that's why I think this should matter to you today, because many, maybe most of you, if this happens, will be in some ways involved in this revolutionary change of the military to match the new grand strategy. So that's sort of my thesis that I'll be moving toward. I'm going to start with a so what. I mean, I teach in the resident program here. Something I do in every lesson I teach at the War College here is I start with the so what. I mean, I think I kind of owe it to you to explain why you should care about this. I mean, it's, in the resident class, whether, I'm teaching Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War or theories of international relations, I always start the class by saying, I recognize, you're not 20-year-old undergraduates, you're senior or to be senior professionals. So I owe it to you to explain why this matters. In this case, I think that this idea that we may be approaching a revolutionary change in American grand strategy, which would in turn require revolutionary change in American military, matters to you in part because you may be architects of this revolutionized military in one way or the other. So in your professional capacity, this should matter to you. But also, all of you are in your own communities idea shapers and influencers by virtue of your professional position, your education, and so forth. So, in addition to participating in this revolution as military leaders or other government agency leaders, you'll also participate as idea shapers. Um, I'll admit that while I have a sense that we are on the cusp of a revolution in U.S. grand strategy, I certainly don't know where it's headed and wouldn't want to try to predict. I mean, as kind of a lifelong student of revolutions, one thing that I've learned is very often revolutions don't end up where people thought they would when they started. So it's hard to say where a revolution in U.S. grand strategy might lead, but I do think that even now it's important to think about it. I mean, I think it's important to, when you're running, when you're driving or whatever, say, okay, if the US goes in this direction in coming decades, if political leaders of the nation decide that we want to do this rather than that, what might that mean for the US military in terms of organization, size, technology, mission, purpose, and so forth? So that's the so what. That's why I think that what I'm going to talk about today is important to you. Very briefly, my plan of attack for this is I want to start with kind of a brief conceptual framework. I know you've thought about grand strategy, read about it, probably just, talked about it during your time in the War College. So what I'll be doing in this conceptual part is probably not telling you anything new, but at least reinforcing what you've read. And I'll kind of explain in just a second why, when I began thinking through what I wanted to do with this presentation, I thought it was important for me to kind of set and do the conceptual part up front. I'll do just a bit of history and talk about kind of the evolution, the adjustment of U.S. grand strategy over the last 77 years. But then I'll get to kind of the heart of the matter, the part that deals with my thesis. And that's where I'll talk about what I see as a potential coming revolution. To use a political science phrase, maybe a proto-revolution now. And I'll talk about what I think is driving the change, what I think is undercutting the validity of this grand strategy that the U.S. has operated with since 1945. So let me start with the conceptual part. I thought it was kind of important for me to kind of show my work as I kind of followed the logic through in this. So this is kind of like what you might do in a math problem where, teacher always told you, I don't want you to just give me the answer, but I want you to show me how you got there. So what I'm doing here is kind of showing you the way that I thought this problem through to reach my analysis of this potential revolution. And I'll tell you over the next 2 or 3 slides as I do this, kind of the way my brain works is I'm somebody that whenever I look at a complex issue, problem, challenge, or whatever, I really try to distill it down to its bare essence. Kind of really, have this kind of Zen brain, you might even say, where I really look at the bare bones. So what I'm going to give you the next couple of slides is kind of my essential framework for thinking about and understanding grand strategy. First point is that I think of grand strategy not as a formal plan. I mean, we all know the U.S. publishes a national security strategy every few years. I mean, we're supposed to do it every year, but we do it every few years. That's not the U.S. grand strategy, but grand strategy is a pattern of problem solving, priority setting, and threat management. So, it's a way of trying to deal with the complexity of the world, and it's a goal seeking method of problem solving. And you can see here, as I tried to distill this to its essence, I said, well, a grand strategy, any grand strategy, the US's today or in the past, any other nation has six basic components. And I've just, I've kind of listed them there. Certainly has a broad notion, of the appropriate role that the nation should play in the world, has a general identification and prioritization of strategic objectives. It has some sense of the opponents or threats to these objectives. It identifies preferred and acceptable methods or ways. It has a broad definition of red lines, and it has an identification of the appropriate level of effort as the nation tries to seek its national interest. So, I would hope at this point in your education, you can kind of take those six components and could sit down and, and talk about U.S. grand strategy over the past 5 years or whatever within those six components. The third bullet here is I think it's also really important for us to remember that the grand strategy of any nation has both internal and external drivers or determinants. I mean, sometimes we in the US tend to forget that not only does our grand strategy reflect our internal politics and preferences and society and culture, but so too do other nations. I mean, I see this over and over again when we're dealing with something like the challenge from Iran or North Korea. We tend to think that they are solely responding to what we're doing to them, when in fact their grand strategy very often reflects their internal determinants as much as their external ones. So when you look at the world, you become a strategic leader, a strategic planner, an analyst of one kind or the other. Always remember that the internal dynamics of other nations matter greatly in how they behave. Effective strategies. One of the peculiar things about strategies is they require constant refinement and adjustment. And, we as Americans, I think in particular, sometimes tend to forget this. We go, okay, things are going great in the world. We're doing okay. So let's keep on doing what we're doing. But what happens in strategy is even things that work already have the seeds of their own decay and their own obsolescence. So you have to constantly be adapting, innovating, and thinking about what comes next. There's one of the books that really influenced my thinking the most on strategy was written by an analyst named Edward Luttwak, and it's just called Strategy: The Paradoxical Logic of War and Peace. And he really developed this notion of what he calls the paradoxical logic of strategy. What it means by that is the kind of linear logic that we're all used to thinking about. You have a cause, you have an effect, doesn't really work in strategy. And in large part, that's because a nation is dealing with other nations and other entities that are scheming, they're seeking their own interests, they're trying to undercut what we're doing. So one of the things that Luttwak draws from that is one of his laws of the paradoxical logic of strategy is what works today probably won't work tomorrow. The way I kind of think about this, I mean, sometimes sports analogies kind of work. I mean, when I think about a strategy, I go, a coach goes into a game with a game plan, but good coaches at least also make major halftime adjustments once he or she sees how the first half played out. The same thing with strategy. So at the same time that you are implementing today's strategy, you need to be aware that that some point in time in the future, what you're doing today is not going to work as well or might not work at all. So you have to constantly be thinking about what comes next. What's the next step? What's the next innovation? The fact that the global security environment changes also means that there has to be a constant refinement and adjustment, and means ends imbalances sometimes develop. I mean, balance is one of the most important things in strategy. So as a nation's means and ends kind of get out of whack, you have three options. You can either downgrade your ends, you can make your ways more effective, or you can increase the means. So it's important to be constantly innovating, improving, changing, switching strategy. And I would argue that's really, really difficult for the United States for some reasons I'm going to touch on later, because of the nature of our strategy making process, because we are making strategy in a democracy, because we have Congress involved as well as the executive. strategic change is particularly hard for the United States. I mean, in other nations where strategy is whatever Vladimir Putin says, then strategic change can be relatively easy when you have a paramount leader and a concentration of political power. But in the U.S., where you have public opinion matters, congressional opinion matters, and so forth, strategic change is really, really hard, but it's also really, really important. So, successful nations, I would argue, are ones that think and act strategically, and nations can choose to not do that. I mean, some nations are more strategic than others. Successful nations are ones that constantly refine and adjust their strategy, whether through formal means or informal means. And the U.S., I would argue, has the most elaborate formal mean of strategy ever, and develops methods to identify, educate, reward, and empower strategic leaders and thinkers. And on this idea of why this is difficult for the United States, I mean, one of what I thought was a really pithy observation on that is a friend of mine, T.X. Hammes. You may have read some of his stuff sometimes. He's a retired Marine colonel, has been at the National Defense University for a long time. Really, really brilliant thinker, and also quite witty. But I've heard him point out many times that the United States is a nation that has a political system designed by geniuses specifically to not be effective. I mean, that's what the founding fathers set out to do, was to make a government that didn't really work very well, because that way it couldn't become tyrannical and repressive. And that made really, really good sense in the 1780s, when the primary threat was, in fact, a tyrannical government. But it also is an impediment to effective strategy. Because we have a political system that was specifically designed to not be very effective, and certainly not very efficient. So that's just something that, we as Americans, we can't change that. We can't rewrite the Constitution. We wouldn't want to, but that is something to keep in mind, that strategic change and adjustment and adaptation is both important and hard. Kind of getting into the history here, I think it's also important to remember that in terms of grand strategy, the United States has a number of what I call intermixed traditions, most of which go back to literally our beginning as a nation, and they have kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. And one of these is what I call the crusading spirit. That the United States was a nation defined not by ethnicity or race or religion, or a ruling family, but by values. I think that has influenced our grand strategy, in that really for a very long time we've had this kind of proselytizing element, that we've seen our grand strategy as a way to not only promote national interests, but to spread democracy and human rights as well. And I can tell you that there's any number of times that I've given talks on U.S. strategy to foreign audiences around the world, and somebody will put up their hand and say, "Listen, you guys talk about all this human rights and democracy stuff, but you don't really believe that, do you?" And I say, "Well, in a way, we kind of do. We really do take that seriously. That is mixed with other traditions, and there are times that we, in our grand strategy, for other reasons, have done things that, in fact, did not promote the spread of democracy and human rights. But I think that it would be a mistake to say that this doesn't matter to Americans. What's called American idealism. It is there. It is real. It may or may not be dominant at any given time, but it is a factor." I also think that this crusading spirit has given us a fairly low tolerance for moral ambiguity. And we have this almost obsessive need to be seen as on the side of good and to have partners. I mean, that's kind of affirmation. If we go do something and we have other nations that join us, to us, that's kind of a sign that we're doing the right thing, that others want on board as well. I mean, in fact, that may or may not be true, but we really do need to see ourselves as doing good in the world. I mean, think of the Navy recruiting campaign recently. The Navy, a global force for good. And and again, I had this conversation with people from other countries, and I go, that's not just public relations. We really do believe that. So you got to take that into consideration. Second important tradition, though, is disengagement or at least limited engagement with great power politics. I mean, probably you're all aware of the warning that George Washington gave in his farewell address that the nation should avoid entangling alliances. You may also have heard of the statement from John Quincy Adams, who was, of course, our Secretary of State, a president, is very often considered the most intelligent U.S. president ever. But he famously said that the United States, quote, goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. So what I'm getting at here is there has long been a tradition in the United States that while we would love for every nation around the world to be democratic and free enterprise and market economy and respect human rights, there is a tradition that says, but we can't go out and do that for them. The best thing we can do is to be the best democracy we can be, as a symbol, as a model for others. But we can't make that an element of foreign policy. So that's one tradition. The other tradition is that we should actually incorporate the spread of democracy and human rights in our grand strategy. The disengagement from power politics, I made the bullet here that we always had kind of a caveat there that never applied to the Western Hemisphere. Even from the early 1800s, we always felt that it was appropriate for the U.S. to be hegemonic in the Western Hemisphere, even at the same time that we were on and off trying to stay out of great power politics, particularly in Europe. The third thing here is what I call economism, and that's the idea that U.S. grand strategy has really since our beginning as a nation been heavily focused on economic interest. I mean, U.S. grand strategy has, and to some degree remains today, very focused on preserving access to markets and raw materials. And that was because we could afford to do that. We were a long way from other great powers. There was little chance that anyone was going to conquer us, so we could focus our grand strategy on the economic element. Legalism. For a long time, the US's grand strategy placed great stress on international law and building a rules-based international law-based global system. I will say that post 9/11, we moved away from that to a large extent, but at least that tradition is still there. There's also a tradition of realism, at least for the last 100 years. It was a European import. It was kind of interjected into our thinking about strategy when we had Europeans very often fleeing Nazism that came to the U.S. and tried to kind of school our officials on how to think about strategy. People like Hans Morgenthau, that some of you may have read, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, or whatever. Realism, as you probably know, is a way of thinking about the world that says all that matters is every nation tries to augment its own power. And leaders may talk about democracy and spreading freedom and all of this kind of stuff, but all that matters in the end is augmenting your own national power. So this is this really kind of cold-blooded, non-idealistic way of thinking about it. And we are both idealistic and realistic at the same time. And the final thing here that I thought was important in terms of tradition is a reliance on technological solutions to strategic problems. And let me just give you kind of one example of what I'm thinking about there. During the Cold War, when we realized that we had to help defend against the Soviet threat, America's political leaders made a decision that we weren't going to try to match the Soviet armor, Soviet military, soldier for soldier, tank for tank. We just, for a whole variety of reasons, we didn't want to do that. What we were going to do was we were going to counter their quantitative superiority with qualitative superiority here. So we had better technology, better trained people, and so forth. So that's been kind of an element of American strategy for a long time. Okay. The United States has, since the beginning of the Cold War, made episodic adjustments of its grand strategy. I mean, you probably know from reading history that during World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt's idea was that after World War II, there would be kind of this condominium of the great powers that would work through the United Nations to assure the security of the world and prevent the outbreak of another major war. Well, that of course quickly fell apart as the Cold War emerged, as it became clear that that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be part of Roosevelt's idea for the post Cold War world. Again, you probably read the history that from say 1945 up until about the Korean War, the United States gradually and to some degree grudgingly accepted leadership of the West, or what then was called the free world. We built an institutional structure and alliance network to do that. Most importantly, NATO, but there were a number of other treaties as well. And we built and sustained a large peacetime military, something we'd never done in our history before. I mean, the U.S. tradition was that when you got into a war, you built a military. Once the war was over, everybody went home. And we thought at the end of World War II we were going to do that as well. If you kind of go look at the figures, like at the beginning of 1946 or by mid 1946, I mean the U.S. military had just almost disappeared. But with the beginning of the Cold War, and particularly after the Korean War, we realized that for really the first time in our history, we were going to have to sustain significant peacetime military power. And that's something that became a crucial element of our grand strategy and continued till today. We made another adjustment post-Vietnam with the opening to China, what was called the Nixon Doctrine, that President Nixon said the U.S. would support allies, but not with ground forces. And post-Vietnam was also the time where arms control and détente with the Soviet Union became part of our grand strategy. We faced a big inflection point with the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And this is kind of interesting, I mean, because I remember, sitting here and at the Air War College where I was before then, kind of watching these decisions being made, watching the debates that's taking place between, thinkers on national security. When the U.S. first became involved in the Cold War, the late 1940s up till about 1950, the thinking at the time was that that was going to be temporary. The idea was we would be the leader of the free world. We would build this large peacetime military simply because the Soviet Union was threatening and because all of the other great powers, particularly France, Britain, economies were so bad that they couldn't do it. But the idea in the late 40s was this was going to be a temporary period in history. But strangely, once the Soviet Union went away, there were really very, very few voices saying, okay, Cold War is over. We certainly did downsize the military at the end of the Cold War, but we didn't come home. I mean, basically what had happened by the end of the Cold War is the US had kind of grown to like primacy, like being the global power. I use the word like, kind of lightly, but at least the argument that was made, and you had to go back and look at the debates in, journals like Foreign Affairs and the New York Times and Washington Post, the early 90s, people were saying, listen, we gain a lot from global primacy. So even with the Soviet Union gone, let's hang on to this. So the end of the Cold War led to what pundit Charles Krauthammer called the unipolar moment. This period of time in the 90s where the U.S. was clearly the paramount nation around the world. No one was close to us economically, technologically, or militarily. Ironically, at the end of the Cold War, there was, if anything, an increased reliance on military power in our grand strategy. Kind of go back and look at the Cold War. I mean, security assistance, the economic element, the diplomatic element were all kind of co-equals. But strangely, those things atrophied more than military power at the end of the Cold War. Then the other big adjustment, of course, was post 9/11. I mean, we've all lived through that. There was all of a sudden there was a clear focus again. In the 90s, there was no clear focus on what our grand strategy was about. At least in the years immediately after 9/11, it was clear again. And our grand strategy became even more military centric than it had been before. But, and I thought it was important to put here, one of kind of the defining factors of U.S. grand strategy in recent years is that the global war on terrorism was basically put on the national credit card. This is the first time we'd fought a major war where we didn't, sell bonds and implement rationing and increase taxes. Basically, the Bush administration made a decision that we could expand the size of the military, we could develop this very military-centric approach to the problem, but we would sort of pay for it later. And I think that's really important in kind of understanding where we are today. Okay. Today, there are major debates underway. I mean, I was kind of surprised in the early 1990s that there weren't debates on kind of the big questions of America's role in the world to any great degree. But today, I think we're beginning to see a number of big debates. And this to me is one of the indicators that we might be in a pre-revolutionary phase, that people are asking big questions about the US's role in the world, about US grand strategy in a way they didn't before. Number one here, and I think most important, is that there is an increasingly intense debate over the wisdom of a US grand strategy based on global primacy. I mean, again, into the Cold War, no one stood up and said, okay, we don't need primacy anymore. Today, there is a body of thought saying that the US can no longer afford global primacy the way we could in the past. If you had a chance to look at the articles that I suggested as kind of a preface to this, there were three of them that give you kind of a picture on this. One was by a guy named Hal Brands, who argued that the major tenets of the Biden grand strategy is to reinvigorate American primacy in leadership, primarily by working through partners. So the Biden grand strategy, I think, is very much a traditional one. I mean, the Biden strategy is a continuation of what the U.S. has done since the end of the Cold War. But we all know that President Trump began to question the viability of primacy. I mean, his argument basically was it's kind of a nice to have. The U.S. global primacy, the U.S. being the manager, engineer of world order, simply wasn't worth what it cost us, that we were getting kind of the raw end of the deal. So about the same time, a school of thought has emerged among people that think about grand strategy in foreign policy called the restraint thinking. And two of the other articles that I pushed out, one by Justin Logan and one by Daniel Bessner, were both out of this restraint school. The restraint, the restrainers, have also begun to develop kind of an institutional, organizational base in Washington. There's something called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. A lot of them have come out of something called the Cato Institute, that is a traditionally libertarian think tank. And there are also a few members of Congress like Senator Rand Paul. These are people that argue that whether or not primacy made sense in the past, that both ethically and financially and strategically, we need to begin to wean ourselves off of this. I mean, some of them will come right out and say the U.S. became addicted to primacy during the Cold War. We being the world's dominant power. And you can kind of understand that, but at least, what some of the restrainers argue is we need to move beyond that. And, and I push these articles out because even if you are not what's called a restrainer, you're not somebody who's in the restraint school of thought, this is an increasingly important position. And it's something that has support on both the political right and the political left. To take one example, the Quincy Institute that was just formed about 4 or 5 years ago had two sources of funding. One was George Soros coming from the political left, but the other was the Koch brothers foundation from the political right. So on both the left and the right, there is growing power behind this idea of restraint. Okay, now here's the kicker. Keep in mind that the U.S. military that you are part of, that you have grown up in, that you will help lead in the future, was specifically designed as an implement of global primacy. So if in fact this restraint school of thought continues to grow, if the U.S. moves more toward a more restrained, less militaristic global strategy, Certainly, the military will need major redesign to reflect that. Um, I mean, I think what we're seeing here is kind of the George Washington, John Quincy Adams tradition coming back to life. Today, we're seeing a so-called America First movement that is no longer simply a creation of or an implement of former President Trump, but it's kind of taking a life on its own. Again, try to imagine what a U.S. military in the future might be like if we were no longer focused on primacy and if we were no longer partner centric. If we kind of backed off on this idea that the method for U.S. grand strategy is partners, and just kind of let that roll around in your head and think of how what you would do would be very different than it is today. Geographic focus. The U.S. appears to be disengaging to a large extent from the Middle East, which has really been the focus of our national security strategy since, at least the early 1990s, and undertaking a long discussed rebalance toward the Asia Pacific. We all know that the Middle East and Europe were the parts of the world that were really army centric. Asia Pacific less so. So, if you assume that kind of this change continues, then, as you all know, that there's a huge discussion within the Army over, okay, where does the Army fit in? A final part of the current debate is the preferred strategic ways. There are a lot of people in the restraint school arguing that we should have a less militarized grand strategy. There was something, I checked my Twitter feed this morning and there was someone arguing that however much we talk about kind of, the downsizing the military and stuff like that, other agencies like the State Department have been just gutted post Cold War. The U.S. Information Agency went away. The Agency for International Development is, a shadow of what it was during the Vietnam period. So this is another argument here: is do we need to, even if we continue to pursue a policy of primacy, do we need to move toward a less militarized version? Okay. Now let's kind of get to the idea of is a revolution coming? Okay. I just outlined these debates that are raging right now. It's not clear whether these debates will lead to modest revision or revolution. But as I kind of thought this through, it seems to me that there are 5 things that signal to me that we are at least in a period of potential revolution. So what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is kind of walk through this, why we might have a revolution in our grand strategy, which would then require a revolution in our military strategy and military organization. The first of these is domestic politics and economics. And I have 2 things here. One is economic challenges, and the first is factionalism or partisanship. And I'll tell you, as a longtime student of American grand strategy, American strategy in general, today's hyperpartisanship probably worries me more than anything else. There was, there's kind of this myth about the Cold War period. There was a phrase that often showed up saying that politics should stop at the water's edge. Well, in fact, that never really did that. We never had a truly universally bipartisan foreign policy or national security strategy during the Cold War. But we did have at least a functioning degree of bipartisanship and some deference to the president. There was generally an attitude that you could have, partisan debates, but once a policy was decided on, and particularly when the U.S. was engaging an adversary or enemy, then partisanship stopped. Today it doesn't. Today we are in a situation where whatever a president of either party does, there will be people in the other party, including elected officials, who will oppose it simply out of default. I mean, we're seeing some just, I mean, really strange examples of that recently. Like just to, take a couple of examples. There have been a couple of congressional resolutions in the last few months. And congressional resolutions, keep in mind, are not law. They're not treaties. They're simply Congress saying, here's what we think. There was a resolution a couple of months ago saying that the U.S. should collect information on Russia's war crimes in Ukraine, should just simply collect it and keep it so that it possibly could be used later for war crimes trials. I mean, that was all it said. Well, there are a number of members of Congress voted against that. I kind of looked at that and, it's almost kind of jaw dropping because I'm going, why would you possibly be opposed to that? And I never heard a real explanation by those who voted against it. But the only thing I can figure was that since the Biden administration wanted this, there were certain people that were going to vote against anything the Biden administration wanted. And again, I'm not, saying one party's right, one's wrong, because I assume that, the inverse court or has happened otherwise. There was a resolution recently on the part of Congress simply saying that they welcome Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Again, this doesn't have the force of law. It's not a treaty, anything like that. Just simply saying that they welcome them. Well, there were a number of members of Congress that voted against that. So again, my only explanation for this is we've reached a point where significant numbers of members of Congress are going to oppose anything that a president of the other party does. And that's really, really makes it hard to run a coherent foreign policy. I mean, we're already seeing now on the part of America's adversaries like Iran that says, well, okay, we don't need to deal with a president because we can just wait until things flip again and everything's going to be completely different. Why should why should the Iranian regime agree to what former President Trump wanted? Because it would flip in a few months and so forth. And here's why this hyper partisanship in our foreign policy and strategy really concerns me. I mean, you see lots of people that write about this and they go, this is bad. We need to stop doing this. I don't think it's simply a matter of choosing to do otherwise and choosing to go back to a period of at least working bipartisanship. Because I think what's causing the hyperpartisanship in the United States today, and this is true not only in foreign and national security policy, but in everything, is what I call our national information ecosystem. I mean, basically, extreme hyperpartisanship, combativeness is profitable. There are people that make a lot of money from opposing anything that the other party does. And since most of the information for most Americans comes from the private sector, we have people who are mired into this kind of these hyper-partisan bubbles. And that's what kind of frightens me because I can't see a way out of that. If we're in this national information ecosystem that is hyper-partisan, it's profitable, it's protected by the First Amendment. I can't see a way out of that. I wish I had a solution, but I don't. So I'm really afraid that we're going to continue to be, if not paralyzed, at least constrained by hyperpartisanship for the coming decades. Second thing that may indicate that a revolution is happening or is possible, is that I would argue that great power war, the possibility of great power war is more realistic now than any time it's been since at least the end of the Cold War. But yet, I think, and I keep hammering this over and over again in my own talks and writing and so forth, I don't think that the U.S., the military, and the government as a whole has done nearly enough thinking about how the U.S. might mobilize for a protracted big war. I mean, do we have any idea how we could build we could expand our military by 4 or 5 times, again, the way we did at the beginning of World War II? Do we have any idea how we could mobilize the defense resource base? Do we have any idea how we could convince the American public to stay behind an expensive, bloody war that lasted for years? So, I think we're at this period where at least the potential for major great power protracted war is greater than it's been for a long time. But I don't think we've given it nearly enough thought yet in the United States as a whole. And again, this is not just the military, but in the think tank community, academia, and so forth. Third thing that I think might indicate that a revolution is happening in strategy is climate change. I mean, we all see it on a regular basis. I mean, one of the things I do in the resident course here is I am the course director for the Africa Regional Studies course, and I can tell you that right now climate change is absolutely paramount in security in Africa. It's causing massive migrations. It's potentially causing the collapse of governments. It's certainly causing the weaknesses of governments. And I think if anything, that's just simply going to continue in the future. We're going to see more and more disruptions in the global security system based on climate change. And the traditional American grand strategy, the one that we all know and love, that's been around, more or less since 1945, simply is not equipped, I would argue, to deal with that. Two more other things that I think are indicators that a revolution is possible, perhaps even probable. I need to kind of go into a little bit of detail and explain what I mean by these. One is the idea of deglobalization. Okay, at the beginning of COVID, there were just a number of articles that came out that really kind of caught my attention that made the argument that over the past 50 years, the world has developed this super globalized, interlinked, connected economy. I mean, just, an example, it always amazes me. I've got an oak table and chairs in my dining room. I turned the chairs over one day and noticed that they were made in China. So, I mean, we were in an economy where it actually was economically efficient to, the oak was probably cut in Canada, sent by ship to China. They made the chairs, they sent it back here, trucked it across the country, and it came to my furniture store. So we have developed this economy where everything is connected to everything else. And what we've seen during COVID and post-COVID with the supply chain disruptions is that this super linked globalized economy has a lot of potential risk. So I think that there is going to be increasing political pressure to deglobalize to some extent or the other, not completely. And I think that technology is going to make that economically feasible. Uh, I think things like additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, new materials are going to make it possible for places around the world to make things locally rather than buy them from China or India or wherever. Okay, but here's the deal: U.S. strategy, at least since the end of the Cold War, is based on the idea that instability and conflict anywhere affects the United States. So that's why we needed a strategy of primacy, and that's why we needed a power projection military. I mean, you don't see it as much in the strategy documents now. But if you go back and read the national security strategies of the Clinton administration, I mean, that argument was made up front that we needed a military that could go anywhere and do anything. We needed power projection because people in Indiana were dependent on, because instability in Central Asia would affect people in Indiana. Okay, but if we undergo some degree of deglobalization, if the economy of Indiana is no longer tightly linked to political stability in Central Asia or the Persian Gulf, then people might say, okay, so why do we need this primacy and this power projection military? So I think that there is going to be an increasing argument that primacy in the power projection military that we have today is an unnecessary luxury. That we can just kind of wall ourselves off. We can make what we need here. We can grow what we need here. And if there's instability and war and famine and disruption in other parts of the world, I mean, that's sad. We'll send some humanitarian relief, but we don't need to go in and stabilize it. We don't need to go into Somalia, to the Balkans or somewhere like that and stabilize them. Because in fact, we can just kind of economically wall ourselves off from them. Now, again, I'm not necessarily advocating this, but I think that you're going to see that argument more and more. And as that happens, people are going to say, okay, tell me again why we need the military we've got if we no longer need to go kind of try to stabilize everywhere around the world. Okay, the final thing is what I call the reconceptualization of security. And what I'm going to try to do here is just kind of briefly summarize what I'm thinking here. Actually, have a whole long presentation on this. If anybody's interested in what I say in the next 5 or 10 minutes, just drop me a line and I'll send you the presentation. But I think that COVID may be the catalyst that causes the U.S. and other nations around the world to rethink how we think about security in the most basic fundamental way. And I pulled kind of one slide out of my this longer presentation that I'll use to explain what I mean here. Okay, what I would argue is that for most of American history, we had a conceptualization of security that was adversary focused. We looked at who are potential or real adversaries. We built a security apparatus to deal with them. Most of the time, that was other nations or kind of non-state opponents. Therefore, we had an adversary-centered and military-centric conceptualization of security. But I think what we may be shifting toward is what I call a triangular conceptualization of security. I mean, we're still going to have some identifiable adversaries out there. That's still going to be primarily the military's job. But I think we may be moving toward a notion of security that also includes unidentified adversaries, where we know that we're kind of under attack, things are happening, we don't know exactly who it is, and it's kind of hard for the military to deal with that, right? And I think we're going to see increasing emphasis on what I call threatening conditions. Pandemics, climate change, infrastructure decays, fragmented public will. Here's a little mental exercise to do as you think this through. Think about how much destruction COVID did to the United States versus the potential destruction that Al Qaeda or Iran could do. But yet we don't really have a we didn't really treat COVID like a security problem. I mean, it was public health, but it kind of wasn't security. Security was still focused on enemies. But I think that may be changing. And if you think about it, if we move toward this triangular configuration, then what that would mean is that the military is still going to be a very, very important part of security, but not the dominant part. Kind of the way I phrase this is I think that we may be at a point 10 years from now, 20 years from now, where the military is a supporting element of security rather than the supported. I mean, we've had this system for all of our history where, we have other Department of Homeland Security and stuff like that that supported the military in terms of augmenting security, but it was primarily the military's job. But I think we might be moving toward a point where the military is the supporting. The military's primary job in security might be things like providing logistics and intelligence and stuff like that to other agencies rather than being the point of the spear. The military is the shaft of the spear rather than the point of the spear. And think about how different a military we would need if this shift takes place. We have a military designed to defeat enemies, to do global power projection. But if U.S. grand strategy and our conceptualization of security is no longer based on those things, then we would have to sit down really almost with a blank sheet of paper and say, okay, what type of military do we need to play a role in this new world? How might it be organized? How big might it be? And specifically, what might its functions be? So again, these are all kind of signs to me that we may be at the beginning of a revolution. Okay, the mainstream position today, if you kind of go look at the literature on national security, is that revolutionary change isn't going to happen. U.S. grand strategy will continue pretty much as it is with only some modest adjustments. Okay, if that's true, it'll make your job a lot easier because you understand, how to do what we've been doing for the past 77 years. But I would make the argument to you that it's also important, when you've got a minute, when you're running, driving, or whatever, to do the what if thinking. Think about what it might mean for the Army, the Joint Force, the United States in general, if any of these revolutionary drivers comes to pass or some combination of them. So I think we're at a point now where I would not argue that it's time to kind of totally go out and redesign the U.S. military right now. But I think that there are enough signs that might be required in the future that it's at least important to think about. The title of my talk referred to grand strategy in interesting times. Probably most of you know that there's an old Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times," because the idea is that interesting times are also times of disruption and conflict and chaos and change and things like that. So, throughout most of Chinese history, you were actually insulting someone if you said, "May you live in interesting times." In terms of grand strategy, and the military strategy to help implement it, whether we like it or not, I think we live in interesting times. So I really believe that the sooner we begin at least thinking about and talking about a revolutionary transformation of American grand strategy, the better we'll be prepared if or when it happens. Right. So this is me. If you want to continue this discussion, outside here today, if I've provoked any interest, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. As I mentioned, I've got this other presentation entitled American Strategy After COVID, where I kind of get into this transformation